anyway, so in 1974, Chizuk was ready to sell the building because they were now established on Stevenson Road, and a group of these congregants got together and said, we're going to buy the building from you and keep it a synagogue. And that's how Beth was established. So we were created to be, I talk about this as being in, for, and of our neighborhood. Right? In 1974, it was more about just remaining in the neighborhood. Then pretty soon we got involved in the community and started some volunteering at the local school, right, at School 61, what was John Eager Howard, now Dorothy I. Heights School, neighborhood greening efforts, rehabbing a couple of homes in the neighborhood, food distribution, whatever, like different kinds of social action, service type things. And then for the past decade or so, we've been focused, in addition to advocacy work and volunteerism, we've also been working on what I call relational justice, right? What does it mean to be of our community, to get to know our neighbors? Some of the Jewish families here live in the neighborhood, but most of the neighborhood is not Jewish, and we're in an interesting position of being the largest religious institution in a majority non-Jewish neighborhood. But because of the history of Baltimore and how North Avenue was originally the border of the city, most of the legacy black churches are south of here and west of here, right? If you think about like Union Baptist or Bethel AME, or right, so those churches are not in Reservoir Hill. They tend to be in, Madison Park and Marble Hill and neighborhoods sort of, down towards Sandtown and not right here. So.
Because this area here is really at one time, like you said, Baltimore at one time only went as far as almost Baltimore Street, and then it started moving up further up to, like you said, to North Avenue.
Yeah.
And this area here was basically the country. This area here was basically the country. And Baltimore itself, when you start looking at these houses here, as some of y'all were coming up here, to see how the architect is extremely, very beautiful, these homes here. Because I used to, as a kid, we lived down there on 2221 Utah Place.
Sure.
And we lived in a beautiful place that they made into an apartment. And I mean, you had parquet floors, you had French doors and everything. I mean, it was just, wow, you live here, you just couldn't really understand it. And then a friend of mine, we went to a party, and they had gas lamps that were still lit, that you could, use that. So, I mean, these houses up around here were very, very high class, very expensive homes people were living in.
I feel good. I live across the street in one of those homes, which, by the way, I paid less than for my 3-bedroom condo in Chicago. I mean, so, we feel, and those of us who do live in these houses feel incredibly blessed. And we don't have the gas lights anymore, but we do have gas. They're like heaters in a couple of the fireplaces where you can kind of light them. Yeah. And there's like a line of gas that goes, and you can turn on, and it'll sort of heat up. Yeah. Like a ceramic surface. Yeah, they're really amazing. It's a great neighborhood, and it was a great neighborhood, and it is a great neighborhood. And one of the things that I try to tell people when people say, "Oh, you live in West Baltimore," this is a wonderful community, and there are a lot of wonderful communities in West Baltimore, and I feel very blessed to live here and work here. So let's start. I want to talk a little bit about synagogue architecture and some of the elements of the service. Is this anyone's first time in a synagogue?
Mine.
Yeah? Okay, so a number of you are. Anyone been in a synagogue before?
Is it your first time?
Who's your first time? Okay, who's been in a synagogue before? Okay, so some of you have. Great. Okay, so hopefully we won't bore those who have. But before we sort of jump into that, I'm curious if there are any burning questions from last time. We covered a lot of ground, and I'm wondering if there's anything people had questions about or wanted to follow up on.
Well, I'm sorry, I missed it, but you don't have an Eruv around this thing.
We don't have an Eruv anymore. Yeah, you want to tell everyone what an Eruv is?
So, from my understanding, it's a blessed line that encompasses a neighborhood that allows the residents to be in a kosher, I don't know if that's the right word, enclosed area, right? So that they can observe Sabbath. And if the Eruv goes down, there's an emergency team that comes out and fixes it, because you can't carry keys, you can't carry, like, there's a lot of things in the Sabbath that you can't do.
Right.
So the Eruv creates some technical flexibility around what you can do on Sabbath.
That's great. So that's a really good description, actually. Basically, the idea is it's a legal fiction that because there are, as Jews understand it, there are 39 prohibitions on Shabbat. Right? 39 things that we're not permitted to do. There are also all these affirmative things that we're supposed to do, right? So on Shabbat, you're supposed to study, and you're supposed to take walks, and you're supposed to take a nap, and you're supposed to eat good food, and on Friday night, make love to your spouse. And there are like all kinds of affirmative things also on Shabbat. But there are 39 prohibitions as well, right? Not making fire, not writing, not spending money. We associate all of those behaviors the way our historic rabbis connected these with the building of the tabernacle in the Bible. So when they build the Mishkan, the tabernacle that's described in the book of Exodus, the different activities that were required to create that portable sanctuary are exactly the activities that are prohibited on Shabbat. In other words, Shabbat is supposed to be a taste of the world to come. And so if the building of the tabernacle was the ultimate creative enterprise, right? And the language in the Torah is evocative of Genesis. So you'll actually see in Genesis, in the Hebrew, language that sounds a lot like language of the building of the tabernacle. And so the building of the tabernacle is like the building of a mini world, right? If the entire world is basically for worshiping God, then the tabernacle was sort of a miniature version of that. And so if that's the best kind of labor, then Shabbat is a time not to contribute to creation, but it's a time to appreciate creation. So we abstain from certain things in order to just be present in God's world and not need to sort of mess with it, right? The other 6 days a week, we hopefully are improving upon the world, right? As partners with God in creation, we're supposed to be doing things to make the world a better place. But on Shabbat, we don't try to do stuff, we try to just be. So the Eruv is a legal fiction because one of the prohibitions on Shabbat is carrying or transferring from one domain to another. And so that's not so practical if you're part of a community where people want to, bring a bottle of wine to a friend's house for a Sabbath meal. And so in order to enable that, you essentially create a collective domain where we're all part of the same community. And then you can carry between different houses. So we don't actually have one here. It's a little bit of a problem. Most of my congregants, it doesn't really matter to them that much. Probably once upon a time there was an Eruv here when it was really a Jewish community, a majority Jewish community, but it hasn't been for many decades now. So.
And how long has that been around? Is that in Israel?
The Eruv? Oh, the concept of the Eruv goes back to hundreds of years, yeah. Yeah.
And what is that word you keep saying?
Eruv. E-R-U-V.
Okay.
Eruv. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I do some economic development work, and I was always fascinated, once I found this out, I was fascinated that the rabbi can write a letter, which is sort of like a proof of, a legitimate, an endorsement, and the recipient can go to anyone in the community and to get something. It could be food, it could be money, it could be, and I don't know what that's called, but I just find the concept really interesting, and I learned a little bit at ICGS Day around Maimonides and his levels of giving, right, and the highest being partnership. So just those two things I'm curious about.
Right. So they're kind of interrelated, that the idea is that your the community, so the Hebrew word for charity is tzedakah, okay? In Arabic, by the way, it's, I think, very similar, tzedakah. And it actually doesn't mean charity, it means justice. So our concept of giving is, it's unjust for anybody to be without certain things, right? To have certain material needs met. Roof over their heads, food on their plate, right? A place to sleep and clothes on their back and a decent education, right? Those kinds of things are expected. Going back to Genesis 1, if we're all created in God's image, each of us is a projection of God in the world. Each of us is intrinsically worthy and sacred, and therefore no human being should be without certain basic needs met. So tzedakah means that when we're giving money to someone who is needy, it's not as an act of kindness, it's actually a requirement because that person doesn't deserve to have the lack of resources that she or he has. So that's when, the writing the letter thing is probably more in Orthodox communities where somebody can have a letter and they'll be able to collect tzedakah. I'm not sure exactly what that's about, but what you're talking about, Maimonides, who was a 12th century scholar, he was sort of a Renaissance man before the Renaissance, right? He was a physician and a scholar and a philosopher, and he lived in Spain and then North Africa, and he had this, what he called the ladder of tzedakah, 8 different levels of giving tzedakah, and you're right, the highest level is actually helping someone to become self-sufficient. So that old story about, to give someone a fish versus if you teach someone to fish, right? So that's the very highest level, is you create self-sufficiency. I was just on a call, actually. We've got 16 Afghan refugee families who are living in the high-rise apartment buildings just to the north of here, the Temple Gardens and the Esplanade and the Emersonian, and the conditions in there are not great. But the families are doing okay, and there's a group of us, there's a synagogue and 2 churches who have been partnering together to resource those immigrant families from Afghanistan. And one of the questions that came up in the meeting we were having today was kind of acculturating them to having to pay their rent, because they're just now, the IRC was providing rent, but then that money eventually dries up and they need to pay their own rent. And a number of them are working, but they're learning how to prioritize their spending, how to budget. They're like, well, do I need to spend it on car insurance? Do I need to spend it on food? Do I need to spend it on sending money back to my family in Afghanistan? And so one of the things they were talking about was how to teach self-sufficiency to these new immigrants who don't yet know how America works and don't know that if you don't pay your rent, you're going to get evicted, and that's a problem, right? So they need to do that. So that's the highest level. But you're right. I think the second highest level is double blind giving, where you give anonymously and the person who receives doesn't know who they're getting it from. So that nobody has to say thank you, because again, it's not an act of generosity, it's just an act of justice.
So someone has to facilitate that.
Well, someone has to facilitate it. So we do that. I'll give, people make contributions. I'm sure my colleagues do the same, right? People will make a contribution to my discretionary fund, and then I'll give someone help, but the help's not coming from me. The help's coming from the person who made the donation to my discretionary fund. So that's a way to do that double blind giving. Yeah. There are other mechanisms too, of course. Yeah. Other questions, or should we do a little show and tell?
Show and tell.
All right. All right, great. How are we doing on time? Okay, great. Perfect. So let's talk a little bit about synagogue. It's funny, we still have our painting. This is done this just presented. We had a little event here we had a talk about the architect who designed this building, a guy named Joseph Evans Sperry. You may not know of him. He's actually, you would recognize a lot of his stuff because he did a number of houses of worship, St. Mark's, so a number of churches and synagogues, and a bunch of other buildings. Actually, the Bromo Seltzer Tower is probably his most famous thing in Baltimore. Sperry did that. So he designed this building, and we had a talk by a guy who, and we had a presentation of this piece that a local artist did. A woman named Jessie DeSantis is a Latina neighbor who created this. And so it's not normally up there on the Bima, but that's why that's there at this moment. So, okay, let's talk a little bit of, well, a word about this building. So the building's 100 years old. The architect's Sperry. The ceiling tile is actually, in some ways, more famous. That's called Guastavino tile, designed by an Italian guy named Guastavino, and this became actually very popular in the late 19th, early 20th century. So you'll see, the best place to see this is actually in like subway stations. You'll see sometimes these vaulted ceilings with this Guastavino tile. So the synagogue that built this building was a relatively affluent synagogue, and they brought in kind of the best stuff, and they built beautiful things. So, all right, so a synagogue there isn't really one way to build a synagogue. It's not like a mosque where there have to be certain elements in certain places. Having said that, there are a few things that make a synagogue a synagogue. So the design of the synagogue is very much in keeping with like church design of the early 20th century, right? If you were building grand churches, you were using these like Moorish designs, and so that became popular in synagogue architecture as well, right? If you look at, there's like a Greek Orthodox church downtown, that's a very similar kind of design. It's got sort of a dome, and it's got, right? So synagogues were, often, and this goes back hundreds of years wherever Jews were living, they would often mimic the architectural style of other houses of worship. So if you were in a Muslim country, you would mimic that. If you were in a Christian country, you would mimic that. This is ironically more of an Islamic style, but it was in vogue in the early 20th century, late 19th century. So that's why it's these high ceilings. It used to be that this bima did not come out this far. It actually went up to where that wall is, and my sort of pulpit was all the way up there. And we took that down because when they were designing synagogues in the early 20th century, the theology of the design was, well, God's way up there, and we're down here, and the rabbi's way up there, and the candles are way up there, and we, the like regular, Jews in the pews, we're down here, right? And so that was the feeling of the relationship with the divine. I would say these days, and certainly Beth Am is a pretty informal congregation, we experience God more between and among us than we do of like way up there. So we brought the bima out and brought the pews around, and we use that downstairs space, and we set it up in the round, and we do I play guitar, and we have instruments. And because for us, like even though this is an amazingly beautiful space, we don't necessarily think of God in this vertical relationship. Yeah.
Are they always raised?
So the word, all right, so that's a good segue to actually talk about like some of the synagogue elements now. So this is called a bima. Bima means elevated space, right? So it's actually, by definition, it's raised. It doesn't actually always happen that way, but that's the idea, is that a bima, so if you talk about like, if you read in the Hebrew Bible, they'll talk about the high places, right? Sometimes the prophets are going on about high places where people are offering sacrifices that they're not supposed to be offering, right? They'll criticize and say, oh, they were, on these high places, they were offering sacrifices, but they should be offering them only in Jerusalem, only at the temple. So those high places are the bamot in Hebrew, right? Same word, bima, bamot, same root, okay? So this is the bima. What are a few other things that you notice in the space that might be uniquely Jewish?
Star David.
Okay, so you see the menorot, the candelabras. Great. And you also see a Star of David. A lot of Stars of David, right?
Yeah, quite a few, yes.
Star of David there. You can see the chandelier also. So that's an image, right? You'll see it up there. Okay. So, those two symbols, the menorah and the Magen David, right, the shield of David in Hebrew or the Star of David in English, are the two probably primary Jewish symbols, right? Christians have a cross. These are our symbols. The Star of David is actually not an ancient Jewish symbol. It actually has nothing to do with David, right? We call it the Star of David, but it is not. It's a few hundreds of years old. I don't remember exactly six-pointed stars pre-existed Judaism. They've been around for a very long time, right? But it only became a Jewish symbol a few hundred years ago. The ancient Jewish symbol is actually the menorah. Mm-hmm. That's the ancient. You'll never hear a six-pointed star described in the Bible, okay? Right? But you will hear this described in the Bible, because that's our ancient symbol. And so this was in the temple, of course, the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. They had the candelabra that was there. It was a 7-branched menorah, okay? 7 for the 7 days of the week. 7 is kind of our number of
Why is the center one not lit?
That's a great question.
That was my question.
Right. So the center one is not lit. That's just a tradition going back in this building. Some people have this tradition that you shouldn't have all 7 flames lit on the menorah until the temple is rebuilt in Jerusalem. The truth is that, of my congregation, which tends to be a pretty liberal congregation, isn't all that interested in demolishing the Dome of the Rock and rebuilding the third temple, but it's a tradition. What are you going to do? It's like Tevye from Fiddler on the Roof, right? It's a tradition. It's a tradition. How are you going to, you can't, I'm not going to be the one who's going to, screw in the light bulb. Okay, so
I had the same
that's what we
question that
do,
you just
right?
asked.
Okay. So the menorah is really the ancient symbol. When Titus destroys, when they destroy the city of Jerusalem, and if you go to Rome and you see Titus's victory arch, it has a picture of the Israelites, going off into exile, and they're schlepping along the menorah, right? No one knows what happened to the original menorah. I don't know, maybe it's melted down by the Vatican or something at some point, who knows? There's so much stuff in the Vatican, you sort of wonder what's actually down there, who knows? But nobody knows what happened to the original menorah. But those are the menorahs, that's a Jewish symbol. What other elements do you see in here?
The book up there, is that a replica of the Torah?
Above the very top there?
Yeah, what is that?
Yeah.
That's a scroll. Not the tablets. The tablets. That's the 10 Commandments. That's what I meant to say. It's 10 Commandments, yeah.
And whether the original 10 Commandments look like that is an interesting question. There is a whole discussion in rabbinic literature about whether it was actually 2 side-by-side commandments or whether it was 1 and then they were printed on either side. There's a debate about this among the rabbis, but this is how it's often been depicted in both Jewish and Christian traditions. So, and the Hebrew letters are just the first couple of words of each of those commandments. So it says, Anochi Hashem, I am the Lord, right? And then it says, Lo Yeh, right? You shall not. So by the way, Jews break our commandments up a little differently than Christians. So for us, the first commandment is actually not we don't call them the 10 Commandments. That's actually good. Remember we had this discussion about whether or not Judaism is a religion, right? So it is, but in some ways it's not in the same way, right? So we break them down. We actually call them the Aseret Hadibrot, the 10 utterances. Because the first one may or may not be a commandment. It's, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt to be your God, right? That's for us, number 1. Number 2 is, you shall have no other gods before me, which is, I think, not how you all break it down, right? Right? It's a little different, right? So that's what that's how they break it down, right? You can see at the bottom of the right-hand side is honor. It says, keep kabed et, right? Honor your father and mother. Okay, and then it goes to the next side, which is all the thou shalt not, right? Lo tirtzach, you shall not murder. By the way, it's not the word retzach in Hebrew. It's not kill, right? The proper translation of what we call the 6th commandment is you shall not murder. Killing is actually permitted in the Torah, but it has to be killing in certain contexts, like killing in warfare or things like that. Murder is there is a word for killing. That's not it in Hebrew. The word is the commandment is thou shalt not murder, and all the rest of them going down to thou shalt not covet. right? Okay. Other things that you notice?
Who changes the light bulb?
Warren, you saw him downstairs.
He gets up in there?
So these go down on a crank, actually. The chandeliers. So he goes up like the way this worked
I'm
is
talking
this.
up in there.
Oh, those things, those lights.
The lights in there.
That's a good question. I don't know. You'd have to get a really big light. I think they're now LED lights, so hopefully we don't have to change them that often. But I think we just need to get a really big ladder. That since the renovations we did that, we actually put that lighting in. I don't think it used to be illuminated that way. These chandeliers actually drop down. There's like a big crank, and you lower them down, which is actually why this one. These are actually, what is it? Plaster of Paris? Is that right? What are they? Would that be a thing that they made it? I don't know. And then you can see this one's a little different. That's because like many years ago, when this was still Chizuk Emunah, whoever was like lowering it down, it got away from him and it shattered and they had to replace it. So that one is, I don't know, it's probably still 70, 80 years old, but it's not quite the same as the ones over there. Yeah.
Well, did you say already the lamp in the middle? Is that
Great. So
internal?
there's two other really key
Is it the lantern?
things. Yeah. So there's what's hanging over the ark, okay, and that is the Ner Tamid, the eternal flame, okay, which also is referenced in the Torah, where it talks about this flame. Now, the original Ner Tamid probably meant, when it talks about in the tabernacle where the flame was eternal, it probably means not like that it burned all the time, but that it was kindled regularly. So it was lit every day. That's probably what originally Tamid meant. Here, we just keep this lit all the time as a symbol of God's eternality. So it's very common in a synagogue to have a few elements. One of them is the ark that contains the Torah scrolls, and the other is the Ner Tamid, the eternal flame. Sometimes you'll see menorahs, sometimes you'll see maybe an Israeli flag, which is in some ways like more of a political statement. Like there are other kinds of things.
Is that actually lit or just?
No, it's a bulb. Yeah, it used to be gas. Actually, when I came here, it was gas. And we had it retrofitted because it's safer. And the truth is, you couldn't really see the gas flame anymore anyway. So you really weren't getting the effect of it. So we had it retrofitted with an electric bulb. It's kind of pretty. I don't know.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
What
So-
are the rules for this space?
What are the
Are
rules?
there rules that govern who can enter, who can?
So there are not rules about who can enter, or everyone is welcome. There are, acceptable practices, right? So generally when we have services, men are asked to cover their heads with a kippah. If they're Jewish, to wear a talit, a prayer shawl. I can show you that. Here's my talit. So when, and there are women who also wear these now.
When you enter Bolton Street, they just have a whole wall.
Yeah, and we have some racks out there that have talitot available for people. You can take a prayer book and take a kippah and take a talit. Some people bring their own. Some people store them in those little things there that open. You can kind of leave things there. Yeah.
So that's their seat.
People have their own seats.
Seat, that's right.
Yeah, they try to claim them. I mean, the name plates on there do not come from us. Those all predate Beth. Those were donated when the building was newer by people who were giving, and then I think they had like their own seats. But we've just preserved them for history's sake. But we're not.
See,
We're
this
like
one
a
has
sit
a
anywhere
name.
you want kind of community. But people,
one has a
people
number
get used
and-
to their own seats. And I think that's comfortable for people. So this is called a talit. And this is a traditional men's garment, though I said some women wear them as well. And it's described in Deuteronomy, right? So there's the description of, I'm trying to remember, no, I guess the tzitzit are actually, that's Parshat Pinchas, so that would be in Numbers. In the book of Numbers, they talk about the fringes on the garments, right? And so I think last time we talked about the mezuzah that you put on the doorpost, right? So in the same, prayer where we talk about that, we add another paragraph to that prayer that comes from Numbers that talks about how a four-cornered garment requires these fringes. And they're tied in a particular way. You can sort of see, I have blue on it. You can kind of see that. So it actually, most of them you see are just white, because for many generations, we actually lost the technology for making this blue thread. So they were just white for a very long time. And only in recent years have they sort of rediscovered the source of what they call the chilazon in rabbinic literature. And it's actually like a crustacean that if you crush it, you get this blue dye. So in the Torah, it talks about that the tzitzit, these fringes, should have a blue thread, patil techelet, a sky blue thread. And that's exactly what this is here. So I have mine with the blue. A lot of people just have it with the white still. Okay? And they're tied in a particular way. You can see that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 knots. And there are, if you were to count them, 8 threads hanging down, right? So 8 plus 5 is 13. And then if you take the letters of the word tzitzit, which is the fringes, and you do a numerology of the letters, right? In Hebrew, like there's something called gematria, which means that each Hebrew letter has a numerical equivalent. Okay, so it's like a code. So Aleph, the first letter, is 1, and Bet, the second letter, is 2, and Gimel is 3, and then once you get to Yud is 10, and then the next letter is 20, right? Sort of like Roman numerals. So if you take the letters of tzitzit, you get 600. You just have to take my word for it. Okay? Plus 13 equals 613, which is how Jews understand the number of commandments in the Torah. So there are 613 mitzvot, sacred obligations in the Torah. 248 of them are positive commandments, things you're supposed to do. 365 are negative commandments, things you're not supposed to do. The rabbis talk about how 365 days of the year, so 248, their understanding, they weren't doctors, right? But they considered 248 to be the parts of the human body. So if you take 248, the parts of all your body, and you worship God 365 days a year, that equals the 613 commandments. So that's what's represented on these fringes.
And mitzvah is a thing you do. In mitzvah, you said mitzvot.
Mitzvot is just the plural. Yeah, so this is the talit, and the plural is talitot. Sometimes you hear an im ending is plural, sometimes you hear an ot ending is plural, and that has to do with the Hebrew is a gendered language. It's like Spanish. Everything's either male or female, masculine or feminine. So the masculine ending, there are exceptions to this, but the masculine ending generally is im, and the feminine ending generally is ot, for the plural, at least. So talitot, menorot, more than one menorah, but the ner tamid, the plural of ner, which is candle, is nerim, because that's a masculine word.
So it's bat mitzvah.
That has to do with daughter or son, right? A son. But you're right. Bar and bat mitzvah, same word. Mitzvah is a commandment, right? So those are, I guess, 9, because the first one, there's actually a debate among the rabbis about whether I am the Lord your God is actually a commandment. But let's say that those are 10 of the 613 commandments. But for us, the 10 commandments aren't, like, there are 613. So yes, thou shalt not murder is very important, but there are other commandments, right? Feeding the hungry is also one of our sacred commandments. And wearing tzitzit is a sacred commandment, and eating kosher food is a sacred commandment. So there are a lot of these commandments. We have a lot of rules.
I
Yeah.
noticed sometimes I used to work with some guys who were Jewish and everything, and sometimes they would have those, fringes on their pants or something?
Yeah.
So why is that?
So it's to be able to fulfill this mitzvah all the time. So they'll wear what's called this is a talit. This is called a talit gadol, a big talit. There's also a talit katan, which can go under your clothes, and it's a four-cornered garment. So the idea is that you're always able to fulfill that commandment all the time. Yeah.
And do the ones that the women wear look the same as the ones that the men would wear?
Sometimes they do. Because this is a tradition, the tzitzit have to be a particular, either white or white with blue, but the garment itself can be anything. So, here's another example of my colleagues. This is his color, right? So you can see it's a different color. So there are women who have done, more feminine colors, different colors. So there's actually a lot of creativity with talitot.
Does the design difference on the two have any significance?
No, I mean, not so much. Why the stripes? Yeah, I don't know, it's a good question. There's some speculation that maybe it goes back to Joseph and his coat, that maybe it was striped, right? Maybe it was a striped coat.
Are you ever able to leave without it?
Yeah, I wouldn't. At night you don't wear it. It's only a daytime garment. So nighttime services, you don't wear a talit. Daytime services you wear, because the obligation is actually, so if you remember from Numbers, it says, so you shall wear these fringes and you shall look at it, right? The Hebrew is in the singular. You, plural, should look at it, singular. So the it that you're looking at is actually the techelim, the blue thread. But since it's a visual commandment, by tradition, visual commandments we only do during the day. Because it's dark at night in a pre-electric, world, society, you wouldn't have obligations to look at stuff at night because it gets dark at night. I mean, you could light an oil lamp, but people didn't have light all the time like we do now. So visual commandments would only be during the day. The one exception to that is on Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, right? Maybe the holiest day of the year, is the only night of the year that we actually wear the talit. We put it on before sunset, but we keep it on for the entire 24 hours, 25 hours of the Yom Kippur. I mean, don't sleep in it, but you wear it at night and you wear it in the morning and you wear it throughout the day. So I want to get you up here and take a Torah scroll out. Maybe one more question for now, and then we'll, yeah.
Two-part.
Yeah.
One is kind of personal.
Okay.
If you would please describe your call to be a rabbi. And the second is, this building is immaculate. Could you describe the practice that is encouraging the congregation around giving and its generosity?
Thank you.
I didn't pay him to say that.
I know you did. You two were in cahoots.
What do you mean, a cheerful giver?
It was, there are still a few things that need some work, but yeah, thank God we were able to put some TLC into it recently, and there were people who were very generous. Some people who were very generous, some people who were less generous, some people who gave, certainly at their own capacity, gave very, very generously. Look, it's not easy. I mean, there actually was not a culture of philanthropy at Beth for many years. This was the synagogue that you came to, took for granted, and then wrote your check to the, Baltimore Museum of Art, or to the, or to Hopkins, or whoever else. So it actually took a while, and I only get partial credit for this. I have lay leaders who were working on this long before I got here and have done yeoman's work. But it took to creating a culture of giving here, where people didn't take the place for granted, but really wanted to invest in the congregation. So we have an annual fund that helps, create our operational fund, and then we had this capital campaign where people gave generously. But it took a while to convince people that was important.
For years, she was the assistant to Donald Schaefer.
Laney.
Laney.
Yeah, Laney Lebo Sachs. Yeah, Lady made a nice gift, and she helped raise a lot of the money, actually.
I remember being in the mayor's office. when
Yeah,
you came to certain-
we're blessed. I mean, we're really, it's a diverse community in a lot of ways, and, you know, there are people here who are affluent and people here who are poor, and we appreciate the diversity that we have, socioeconomic, also racial diversity, also LGBTQ people. We have interfaith families, like it's Jews of color. People, you know, some people are able to do certain things, and some people, but we have been blessed with a meaningful number of people who have some resources, and thank God they were willing to put some of those resources into doing these renovations. It's been really, really wonderful.
And your call to?
My call, yeah. So it's interesting. I would say part of it's indescribable. There wasn't a moment for me. I didn't have like an aha moment of like the skies opened and I realized this is what I was supposed to do. It was more incremental for me, but there is kind of an indescribable feeling of I couldn't imagine myself really doing anything else. And so in that sense, I think I felt a call probably since I was even in high school. I started thinking about that. And then part of it's honestly like I've always been a, you know, kind of a jack of all trades, maybe master of none. And this is a job that allows me to flex a lot of different muscles and learn a lot of new things, right? I mean, I can write and I can preach and I can counsel people and I can officiate at life cycle events and I teach. And, you know, today I was teaching sixth graders Torah study and talking about their upcoming bar and bat mitzvahs, and we were talking about the Afghan refugee families and doing social justice work, and I get to, you know, I learned about, I don't know, architecture and design and raising money, and like, so it's a multi, you know, kind of a multivalent career, and so for somebody who, in Yiddish, you say, gets the shpilkis, like, you know, has answered his pants a little bit. Like, I don't think I could sit at a desk from 9 to 5. I'd get bored. So I get to, like, I'm always doing different things and trying new things. And that I find fun and engaging. And also I get to do it in a way that I feel like is adding some value to my people and hopefully to the world.
I need that phrase again.
Yeah, what's that phrase again? That's it.
Answer my pants? Yeah.
What's the Yiddish?
Oh, shpilkis. It doesn't translate exactly, but it's like, shpilkis is like you can't sit still. Yeah, shpilkis. You got shpilkis. Yeah. Yiddish is a great language. All right, so let's all come up on the Bima. Let's take out a Torah scroll. Okay, so this is the Ark. In Hebrew, we call it the Aron HaKodesh, the Holy Ark. Not to be confused with the Hebrew word for what Noah had, right? This is one of the problems of translation, is Noah had an ark, and we call this an ark, but this isn't that ark, right? So in Hebrew, the word for the boat that Noah had is a teva. Actually, that Hebrew word, and if you get bonus points if you can guess, what Hebrew word, the word teva, Noah's ark, where else in the Torah is that word used, do you think? What other ark is there?
Not the Ark of the Covenant.
Not the Ark of the Covenant. That is Aron. That's Aron. In modern Hebrew, an Aron is a closet.
Noah.
Right? So Noah had the ark, right? So there's Noah's has the ark. This is an ark in English, but it's ark, it's Aron, right? This actually, I'll tell you about that word in a second, but Teva, Noah's ark, is also used in another really key moment in the Torah. So what other vessel is similar to Noah's ark and would have the same Hebrew, therefore would have the same Hebrew word?
Oh my Lord. We're all belly.
All right, so what is an ark? What, like Noah's ark, what is it? What's the difference between an ark and a ship?
The ark is huge.
It's huge, but it also,
The rock.
it doesn't have any steering ability. What makes an ark is it's a vessel on the sea, but it doesn't have a rudder, it doesn't have a steering wheel, right? It doesn't have sails. It's just basically a wooden vessel that you go in and hang out until the waters recede, right? Right. You just kind of bob around, and that's what an ark is. So what other vessel in the Torah is that?
It's not a Jeopardy question, right?
No. That would be like a double, that would definitely be like a final Jeopardy question, right? Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Not when they
All right,
want
I'll
to
give you a
see
hint.
it, see
It's
it,
a
see
lot
it.
smaller, much, much smaller than Noah's Ark.
Is it
In
in
fact-
the basket in the river?
Yes!
Ding, 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 ding.
Basket that carries
The
Moses
Moses
in the river. It's also called the Tevah. Because it's the same idea, right? It's basically a rudderless vessel that goes in the water and floats along until Pharaoh's daughter finds it and
Right.
saves him. So that's exactly the same word, right? This is why it's important to learn Hebrew. Because then you can read your Bible, the original, and you'll appreciate, oh, what's the relationship between Noah's Ark and Moses' Ark? It's basically the same thing, just a much smaller scale. Okay?
Analogy on that, so you're trusting in God.
Also, right, so that's very much the case, that the whole point is, right, you're kind of leaving it up to God to make sure that the inhabitants of that vessel make it to safe harbor. Right? That's right. That's right. That's the
Good job, Mike.
This one is an ark in English, but in Hebrew it's called an aron, and it is connected with the Aron Habrit, the Ark of the Covenant,
Right.
that was inside Beit HaMikdash, the temple in Jerusalem. And so that one contained the original tablets with the commandments inscribed on them, right? This is the Torah scrolls, okay? So each of these scrolls, I'll show it to you. Okay, so each of these scrolls.
And the mic is already hot?
Yeah, it's on. We have a mic, and so then when we're up here singing, the
Yeah,
congregation
you
can
can hear
still hear it. Right, that's right.
Yeah, there's single pastors and I presume there's rabbis that have good voices.
Yeah, well, we don't even have a cantor here. We have two rabbis and both of us sing. So. All right, so we're going to actually undress this and take a look at it together. Okay? So let's see. I need some help. Reverend, will you grab the silver and pull those things
Yes,
off?
right.
Yeah. Okay, and those, you can just put them on those little holders there. See them? Okay, great. And here, would one of you just lift, this is the breastplate. Yeah, just grab that off there. That's good. Okay, perfect. And then actually, why don't we just put that down underneath? Okay. So we adorn the Torah scroll. The Torah scroll was both an extension of those original Ten Commandments in a sense, but it's also adorned in the same way that the high priest was adorned. So if you read the description of the clothing of the high priest, we think of this clothing of the Torah scroll in a similar kind of way. Okay, so similar language that we
No, we're good. We're
ascribe to
good. We're
this.
good.
In memory of Isidore Scherer. Yeah, so this is the family that donated this Torah scroll, original, Torah scroll takes about a year to write. It's written by a scribe,
Right.
Letter by letter. Torah scroll runs anywhere between $20,000 and $40,000, $50,000.
Now, how long did you say again last week? You remind us how long it takes a person to do it?
About a year, yeah. So the scribe will sit, and he or she will basically use an existing Torah, and then model, basically copy letter for letter, to make sure that there's no error in the transcription. So that's why it takes so long, because you have to be meticulous, because if you make a mistake, if any letter is wrong, or if you accidentally write two letters too close together, so two words look like one word, then it's not a kosher Torah. It has to be, every letter and every word has to be written so. And you'll see there are also breaks in the text in certain places, right? That's also prescribed by the tradition. Yeah, if you don't mind holding that. We don't touch here. There's actually, here I have a yad. This actually broke off the other day, which is why it wasn't on the Torahs. We have to get the chain repaired. But we use, instead of touching this, we'll use this, mostly because there are oils in our hands that can degrade the text over time. So we'll just do I actually was just in the guy who made this just donated this year. This thing is beautiful.
This is hand carved?
He handmade this. It's really, if you're ever looking for somebody to do
Where's the
woodwork.
old one?
The old one is like that. It was not in great shape. Yeah, it's not in great shape. Why, you want it?
Let's take a look.
I mean, I don't
We'd be
know.
willing to take a look.
We may have like offered it to Physical Movement for the building, the place to build it. So, okay, so you can see there are gaps in the text here, right?
And the paper looks different too.
And the paper looks different. So it's not paper. This is parchment. This is animal skin. You know, it can be cowhide. It can be other animals. So it's basically the leather is secured in a way. And then what happens is you can see on the back, they take the different pieces of parchment and stitch them together, and then there's sort of like a binding material that they use to hold the individual sections, which is important, one, because no animal is big enough to make just one, right? Obviously, you have to take pieces, but also if it degrades, like, because over time, you know, over decades and even centuries, the letters can degrade and they have to be repaired. Sometimes you notice a mistake that's like a real serious mistake, like a scribal error, where it wouldn't be enough to just like scrape off the letter, because this is written in indelible ink, right? It doesn't soak into the parchment. It actually dries on the surface of the parchment.
You can scrape it off.
Exactly. So you take a razor blade, the scribe will take a razor blade and scrape off the mistake and then rewrite it. This is with oak gall ink. And so they can do that, but if you find an error where it can't just be repaired in that way, you can just replace a section. Right? You can just, instead of having to replace the whole scroll. So it's actually very handy to have it in all these different sections anyway. Okay? So let me show you just like a couple. So right here, where it's rolled right now, this is the Torah portion that we'll be reading this coming Shabbat. So it says, V'yu chaye Sarah mea shana v'esrim shana v'sheva shanim. And Sarah, the life of Sarah was 127 years. V'tamot Sarah b'Kiryat Arba hu Chevron be'eretz Canaan v'yavo Abraham lispod l'Sarah u'leveita li'akom Abraham. So what we're talking about here is, so Sarah dies at 127 years old, and she dies in Kiryat, so-called Hebron. Okay, Hebron, sometimes it's called, the Eretz Canaan, the land of Canaan, and it says that Abraham came to mourn his wife, and then the story goes on to describe him purchasing the Ma'arat Machpelah, the cave where he inters his wife Sarah in this cave in Hebron, which actually ends up as the tomb of the patriarchs. So all of our ancestors are buried there, except for Rachel. If you remember, Rachel gets buried on the road because she dies on the way. But all three patriarchs and the other three matriarchs, right? So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, and Leah are all buried in the same cave, which is south of Jerusalem in Hebron.
How much of your seminary type study extends beyond the Torah?
Oh, a lot. I mean, yeah, because for us, the Torah is the written tradition, but we also have an oral tradition, and there are all these other books that are for us like you remember, in the cereal box you get like a secret decoder ring, right? So you could understand the code. So for us, the written Torah is only one half of the story. So the Torah tells a story. Like here, I'll give you an example from what I just read here. It says that Sarah was 127 years old, okay? But the Hebrew doesn't actually say that. It doesn't say 127. It says she was Mea Shana, 100 years, the Esrim Shana, in 20 years, the Sheva Shanim, in 7 years. So why doesn't it just say 127 years? Why does it say 100 years, and 20 years, and 7 years? That seems like a really lengthy way to say 127. So the Midrash, the oral tradition, interprets that and says that when Sarah was 20, she had the youthfulness of a 7-year-old. And when Sarah was 100, she had the beauty of a 20-year-old. And that's why the Torah writes it that way. So that's not written in the Torah. That's a Midrash. That's an exegetical interpretation of the Torah, handed down from generations. Some people, if you're Orthodox Jews, may believe that story was handed down from Sinai. Conservative or Reform Jews might say that that story was created at other times in oral traditions and then written down at some point. Whatever the case, for us it informs the text. Sometimes it's a narrative midrash like that. Sometimes it's legal interpretations, right? The Torah says elsewhere, if you have a rebellious child, you should take him out to the city gates and stone him to death, right? You may have read this somewhere in the Bible, right? Well, so then the rabbis come along and say, you're not supposed to take that literally. And they actually essentially legislate that out of existence. They say, yeah, sure, if you had a child that fit that description, that's what you should do. But of course you need 2 witnesses. And by the way, he had to have been told that he couldn't do it. And by the way, they come up with so many restrictions that they basically legislate it out of existence. And at the end of this discussion in the Talmud, they actually say such a child was never born and never will be born. So you end up with something in the Torah that if you didn't know better, you'd read it and you'd say, oh my God, those Jews are like about killing their children. But for us, that's never been that way, right? We always understood that you need the oral tradition to inform the written text.
We've all thought it.
Yeah, it's complicated. All right, so let me show you. I'm going to roll to another section. Yeah. No, I'm going to roll to another. Ask your question. I want you to see it, maybe another section. And then
I noticed that you were reading from right to left.
Right to left.
Yeah, that's what it did,
Yeah, the writing.
Very good.
What direction is the writing? Is that all?
The writing is right to left. Yeah. So Genesis is over here and Deuteronomy is over there. And that's, everybody knows the Torah scroll is the 5 books of Moses.
Right.
So for us, the rest of the Bible is important, but it's not nearly as sacred as this. These texts are for us the foundation of our tradition.
And even your Torah is written in English, read that way as well, right?
Even the Torah's, no, in English you read left to right, but, you're talking about when it's in a book form. Yeah, usually like you'll see like this book, here's a prayer book. It has Hebrew and English in it. So the Hebrew obviously reads right to left, the English reads left to right, but the pagination goes right to left. So we use the book right to left. That's correct. Yeah. All right, so I want to show you, it doesn't take too long to get. This is written in a particular way. Right, this is why, by the way, why did human beings invent the codex? Because this takes a really long time. I mean, it's much easier to just flip to a page, right?
Is it frowned
It's
upon?
like, remember cassette tapes, right? You had to wait, but now you have a CD or you have an MP3. You can just, so this takes a real, you can see why this is impractical and why we move toward books like this. But
Rabbi,
this is what books used to look like.
There's a lot of discussion in the Christian tradition with the advent of technology. Clergy use their phones, their iPads to read scripture.
Right.
Is that frowned upon?
So it's not frowned upon. We try not to use electronics in synagogue. In a traditional setting, like an Orthodox synagogue, they wouldn't use electronics because they don't use electricity on Shabbat or on holidays. We will use electricity. We have microphones, and I play guitar, and we'll plug in the guitar and things like that. But we also, for me, it's more of like an aesthetic that, I don't know, we just spend so much time looking at screens. I feel like synagogue is the place to come and look at human beings and look at books and not look at screens. So for me, I don't have a Jewish legal problem with it, but I've been a little resistant to adding
You're old-fashioned.
Tablets from. I'm a little old-fashioned.
I like that.
So I just want you to see. So here's a break.
That's
That's right. So here's a break. You see the break? So that's how you know that we're at a new book. Okay. So here's the end of Genesis. Okay. There's the end of Genesis. Okay. Where Jacob has come down with the family, 70 people, to Egypt. And the beginning of the next book, Exodus, right? We actually don't call it Exodus; we call it Shemot, names, because we name our books after a word at the beginning of the book. So we call Genesis Bereshit because the first word of the Torah is Bereshit, in the beginning, right? We call this Shemot because the second word is Shemot, Ve'ela Shemot B'nei Yisrael, Habayim Mitzrayim. Right? These are the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt at the beginning of Exodus. Okay? So that's that. And I want to show you one other thing that's kind of fun. So sometimes the text actually, the way the text is written, actually tells a story. Okay, so I'm now in the book of Exodus. You know what happens in the book of Exodus, right? We've got slavery in Egypt, and we've got the 10 plagues, and then we have the actual Exodus, the leaving of Egypt. In Hebrew, Egypt is Mitzrayim, from the word sar, which means narrow. So Mitzrayim is the narrow place. By the way, it's also in the Psalms. So min hametzar karatia, from the narrowness I called out to God. Anani b'mirchavia, God responded from the expanse. Psalm 118, I think. Okay, so min hametzar, from the narrow place. Mitzrayim being the narrow place. So the imagery of the Torah is that we were in this constricted place, and then it's actually kind of our birth story, right? So if you think about it, right, in a way like Mitzrayim is maybe prison, or maybe it's the womb, and the sea, when it splits, is maybe the birth canal, right? So there's, like, that's one way to think about what the story that the Torah is trying to tell about what it meant to move from slavery to freedom. Okay,
So
that's what I wanted to show you.
Oh, I asked you too soon.
Yeah, no, it's a great, does everybody see this? So even if you don't read Hebrew, you can see how this is written differently from the other. And there are other things in here, but this is a famous one. So you got the question about the teva, the basket, so who knows?
She gets it.
So what do you think? I told you what story we're in. We're in the Exodus story. Any idea from the narrative what this might be here? What story might this be telling with the calligraphy of how the Torah is written? Are we doing out of time? Okay, this will be our last thing. Yeah, what do you think?
The parting of the Red Sea.
I was gonna say that too. Yeah,
This is the Song of the Sea. This is Shirat Hayam, Moses' song, right? And therefore Moses and the children of Israel sang, and this whole thing, like, who is like you, O God, right? That is here. You can see. So the scribal tradition is to write the Song of the Sea as if it's the water's part.
Okay.
Yeah, so you can kind of get a feel of the letters coming apart like the water's part. Okay?
Is your reading of it different?
No,
In your
actually,
presentation of it?
there is, so when we read from the Torah, we chant it. There's what's called a trope mark. So I couldn't do it right now.
These marks are always live?
But
They're always
yeah, I know
live?
we should probably. Yeah, they're all.
Watch what you say. No, I like it.
Yeah, they're just on. I don't even have. I mean, I'd have to turn them off from the system.
No. I like it.
So, just to give you an idea, so what we're looking at now, it's actually in the prayer book here. You can see it looks kind of like that, right? Right here. So, does it have the trope markings? So, Az Yisrael Moshe B'nei Yisrael Et Hashira Zot L'Adonai V'yamru Le'mor Asher L'Adonai Ki Ga'al Sus V'rachbo Rama V'yam. So that's an example of the cantillation, the trope, and there are markings on these Hebrew letters that indicate the notation. So when somebody prepares to read from the Torah, they have to memorize both the vowels, because this is only consonants. There are no vowels in the Torah scroll. So you have to know, which sounds really hard, but if you think about it, if I were to show you an English paragraph and I take out all the vowels, you could figure out what it says, right? Because if you know what the words are, you get used to how it looks. And in Hebrew, the vowels are written underneath and above the letters, but it's just written consonants. And then there's also this trope marking, the cantillation that's on it, that shows you how to chant it. So you're right, Reverend, the trope for the Song of the Sea is actually a little different. It's more of a melody than it is straight trope. And you have to kind of know how to do that. So it's a little different. Yeah. All right, so I think we need to wrap up because it's 8 o'clock. I'm happy if there are
It's
any
8
sort of
o'clock
final
already?
questions. I know.
Time flies when you're having fun. It's 8:01.
So I'm going to roll it back. If you have any final questions, I have to get it back to where it needs to be for services this coming Shabbat.
So during COVID, as well as for your elder members, there is there live broadcast that goes to their homes?
Yeah, we have a camera right there under the balcony, and we stream our services. We started doing that even before COVID, and it's just become more necessary now. Yeah, would you all also stream services? Yeah, it's great. Look, on one hand, it's
We're working on it.
On the other hand, I also think that we've been in the gathering business for thousands of years, and as much as it's important for people to stay safe, and I wouldn't want anyone to come who is in any way feeling unsafe, I also think that now there are vaccines and there are mechanisms for most people to be relatively safe, and I've been happy to see a lot of people come back in person. It's been really nice.
Again, you're old-fashioned.
Watching this tells you this is the beginning.
What do you mean?
The long.
Here? Oh, it's just for, I think it's just a mechanism for, I'm just looking for getting back to where we were. I need to make sure it's in the right place. This is now we're in the Isaac story. We're not quite in the Isaac story.
The speakers that
Poles were like this. Sometimes it would just be wound on one piece of wood. So probably what happened is they were taking it and they would accordion it. So you would take it out and you would fold it back and forth as you were doing it. And then somebody had the brilliant idea of stitching the accordion sides together, and that became the codex. Yeah. So it's not so practical, but it's cool. Right? I mean, it's still neat. I mean, I'm glad we read from the Torah scroll because it's an ancient practice. And
well, hopefully you will honor us in January and come if your schedule's available to be our guest speaker. As we did before.
I'd be honored, but the truth is I'm going to be on sabbatical.
Oh, wow. I'm jealous.
Not just I would love to.
I'm jealous.
I'm not going to be available.
I'm very jealous.
Yeah, it's here it is. Now we're back in the right place.
You were our King Day speaker.
I did speak with your congregation.
Day,
yeah, that was a great experience. I loved doing that. Thank you. But I'm honored to be asked. All right. Great. So let's see. So this is the medial, right? This is called the mantle.
Yes. This is your pet peeve, raising.
What? Don't even start. Don't even start.
What's he talking about? Is that the breastplate of righteousness? Yeah.
Yeah, so the idea was what Aaron, the high priest, would wear. He had a breastplate, so we have a breastplate as well. So this is going to put back here. And there you want to put the crowns. Yeah, you can just, no, it doesn't matter. You can just kind of.
That could make a wonderful altar boy.
Well done.
Thank you. I'm at my best in the pulpit.
All right, now.
I love the pulpit. Well, I hope you all enjoyed this. Yes, sir. Rabbi Burg, thank you so much.
This
has the mic on it.
Oh, it's just the mic's just behind it. This is actually also a
That's wrong.
Sephardic style Torah scroll. So this was commissioned when the sanctuary was built 100 years ago. They commissioned this as the centerpiece of the bima. So inside it has a parchment as well. It's just a different style of a Torah scroll. Same thing.
Well, I know they're here doing services and worship or whatever, but everybody is always expecting them to be there, or do you open the door when you do the service, or?
Well, when the service is happening, we just keep these doors open, lights on, and then when we come up to take them out, we just open the curtain.
Yes.
But, you know, when we're not in here, then I close it and lock it.
And they got over 450 members.
This is such a big,
What's the capacity of the sanctuary? What's the capacity of?
Do you all mind standing there next to Rabbi Burg? I'm gonna get your picture.
About 1,200. Wanda, I'm gonna take my mask down for the picture.